Here I come. Hello, sports fans, sports collectors, and all hobbyists. Welcome to the Card King Sports and Variety Show. I'm your host, the Catman, Brian Cataquet, a.k.a. the Card King. We are live on ABC's KMET 1490am.com. Your number one spot right here for news and talk on the West Coast. I thank you all for tuning in. We talk Japanese baseball today with our guest on the phone line is award-winning author, Japanese baseball historian. His current ebook and illustrated introduction to Japanese baseball cards provides great information on the topic. We welcome in Robert Fitz. Rob, Brian C., thanks so much for being on the program.
Good morning, Brian. It's my pleasure.
Rob, you are considered a leading expert in the field of Japanese baseball. Let's begin how your love for Japanese baseball began.
Sure. It was about 25 years ago. My wife was a Japanese studies major in college, and she ended up speaking Japanese pretty well, and her company transferred her over there. Started out as a 2-week transfer, ended up being 2 years. So about a month into her work, she called me up and said, "Why don't you come on over?" And so I arrived, and I just finished the 13-hour nonstop flight, then the 3 hours going through customs and getting into Tokyo. I'm extremely jet-lagged. What ended up happening is she was in Tokyo, and she said, "Why don't you come on over and let's live in Tokyo for a few years?" So my first night there, I arrive after a long plane ride, very jet-lagged, and we go straight to a baseball game. And we go to Jingu Meiji Stadium. We get the Hanshin Tigers against the Yakult Swallows in the middle of a pennant race. And these are two teams with a lot of tradition and very loud fans. So it's my first Japanese baseball game, and they're nothing like U.S. games. They have bands, they have cheerleaders, they have songs. It's kind of like a big college football game or a big college basketball game. And this old stadium was shaking with the different horns being blown and the flags and the chants. I was like, wow, this is nothing like baseball in the States. And from that day on, I've become a total fan of Japanese baseball.
Now, you've written 5 books, as I mentioned in the introduction. Your current ebook, An Introduction to Baseball Cards. Talk a little bit about your books and how that came about.
Sure. I'll start with the last one first, the illustrated introduction. It's now out in paperback. Pick it up on my website or Amazon. And that's a silver lining out of COVID. I just published a book called Issei Baseball. It's a history about early Japanese-American baseball. That came out in April. I'm all set to do a big West Coast book tour in May, and, of course, then we had to stay home, and everything was canceled. So I had time on my hands, and I was thinking about what should I do. And a few people asked me questions about history of Japanese baseball cards. They said, hey, I want to know more, what's out there. And I was sending out emails to these people kind of talking about their history. I thought, that would make a really interesting book. And the beauty of Japanese baseball cards, they're so striking, they're so colorful, that I knew this book couldn't just be a dry history. It had to be a picture book. It had to bring out the interesting aspects of the game over there, the interesting aspects of the cards, but especially the beauty of the cards. So that came out in June of this year.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you more about Japanese baseball cards, but let's go over a few of your other works. You also wrote Banzai, Babe Ruth, correct? Wally Yonamine, the man who changed Japanese baseball, right?
Yep.
Name some of your other work.
Well, what it started with is after living in Tokyo, I became a big Japanese baseball fan, and I read everything I could in English about Japanese baseball. And this is before Hideo Nomo had come over the MLB, so there really wasn't that much out there in English. So I had a lot of questions that I couldn't be answered, because I don't read Japanese. I can't really speak it, only a few words. So I figured out, how can I learn about these stars from the 1950s and 40s? Because I had already begun collecting Japanese baseball cards, and I didn't quite know who these guys were other than looking at the stat books. So what I did is I got in contact with this fellow named Wally Yonamine. And Wally actually played professional football one season for the San Francisco 49ers back in 47 off the top of my head. Then he entered minor league baseball and in 1951 moved over to Japan to become the first American star after World War II to play in Japan. And he ended up in the Japanese Hall of Fame. Now, Wally is Hawaiian-Japanese, so he's bilingual. So he was the perfect person to go and talk to about the history of Japanese baseball and the people he played against, his teammates. So I met him at a pearl shop he used to own in Tokyo, and I started interviewing him about what Japanese baseball was like in the early 1950s. And his stories were so fascinating that after about an hour and a half, I walked out of the store and I said, oh my gosh, I got to write a book. At that time, I was still an archaeologist. I was not a baseball writer. Baseball was just a hobby. But I decided to leave my job as an archaeologist and focus on writing this book about the history of Japanese baseball. And that one became my first book. It's called Oral Remembering Japanese Baseball. It's an oral history. I interviewed about 25 fellas who played in Japan, mostly Americans because we didn't have a language barrier, but I also hired a translator to do 5 Japanese. And they told me about the history of the game when they played, and I put it together to tell a history of the game from 1950 to about 2000 or so. And I had so much fun writing that book that the day I handed in the manuscript to the publisher, I called up Wally and I said, no one's written your biography. Would you be interested? And he thought about it for a couple of weeks and said, yeah, let's do that. And so for the next few years, I wrote the biography of Wally Yonemine. He's also called the Jackie Robinson of Japan because he's the first American to go over there after World War II. He faced a great deal of discrimination, even though he looked Japanese, because he was American. He had actually been enlisted in the U.S. Army, although he didn't see combat. He was at times seen as a traitor when he was in the Japanese stadiums. So we did his biography together, and one book kind of led to another. The next one was Banzai Babe Ruth. That's about when Babe Ruth went over with the All-American team in 1934. What makes that book a little bit different, it's not solely a baseball book because there was also a coup d'etat attempt against the Japanese government by a group of military officers. So the book focuses both on baseball and Babe Ruth and Connie Mack's efforts to use baseball to reunite Japan and the United States during a pretty shaky diplomatic time. And also it focuses on these military officers who are trying to overthrow the Japanese government and bring about World War II a little earlier. And after that, it's a few books here. After that, I did the biography of Masanori Murakami. And he is, of course, the first Japanese to pitch in the major leagues when he came over in 1964 and pitched for the San Francisco Giants.
Wow, that's interesting stuff. I mean, we're talking to Japanese baseball historian Rob Fitz. Rob, let's talk about the Japanese baseball cards. Let's talk about several of the Japanese baseball cards issued through the decades. Can you share us some light on some of the issues created through the decades?
Sure. So Japanese baseball cards fall kind of a different path than U.S. cards. So as most of your listeners probably know, U.S. cards were originally advertising pieces. They were put in with tobacco cards. Some of them came as advertising for sporting companies way back in the 19th century through the early 20th century. So these were like collectibles right away, but, giveaway pieces. Now, Japanese baseball cards have always been, or originally were seen as kids' toys. And what started is there's a Japanese game called Menko. And I don't know, do you remember Pogs from about a couple decades ago? Do you remember that fad?
Yeah, I do, yep.
Okay, so Pogs, if people don't remember, are these little discs that you collected and you tossed on the ground. And it was a game. And it lasted, a couple years maybe, right? So that actually is the Japanese game of Menko. Menko are discs that one child would throw on the ground and other children would throw their disc at the first one. And if they flipped it over, they get to keep both. So Menko started probably in the 18th century, but it wasn't until the very late 19th century that they become colorful cardboard discs, and kids start collecting them, and they want the pictures. And at first they were military heroes and samurai and airplanes, things like that. But very soon, baseball players started entering those on them. And that's the first Japanese baseball cards, are these Menkos from the very late 19th century, early 20th century.
Wow. So would you say that's how like card flipping began in the U.S., in the USA in the 1950s? You know, everyone flipped baseball cards against the wall.
You know, I think it's like two parallel developments. I mean, it's possible, right? It's possible that somebody in the U.S. saw it in Japan, but I think it's just like such an obvious thing to do, don't you? That, you know, you got this piece of cardboard, it's got the perfect weight. You know, you just kind of want to toss it, right? So I think it's two the same game played in two different places. Probably came up for different reasons, I think.
So what are the value on some of these Japanese baseball cards, like the Menko cards? I know a lot of the Menko cards I've seen sold in uncut sheets.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say some of the value on the Menko cards and some of the other issues?
You know, it's all over the place. Most of the serious Japanese baseball card collectors are actually Americans. There's a handful in Japan, but most of the serious guys live over here. So the demand for sets is low. It's not like here where people try to put together the 52 top set. In general, collectors over here want cards that look nice and their favorite players. So the value of the cards are all over the place. If you want to just collect nice-looking Menko cards from the late 40s, early 1950s, which is kind of the golden age of the best-looking art, you can pick them up for a few dollars each, up to, say, $20 each for Hall of Famers in great condition. I mean, they're relatively cheap. But if you want to get things like a Sadahara rookie, which is a 1959 card, then you start talking $100 in VG condition all the way up to over $1,000 in nice near mint condition. There's also cards of Americans who went over there. There's some Babe Ruth cards from the 1934 tour, of which there's only maybe a half dozen known to exist. And in my opinion, these are incredibly undervalued cards because they don't have a developed market in the United States. They're far rarer than the Honus Wagner or Ruth rookie or anything like that. You just can't buy one. But because they don't have a long record of being on the auctions here, you know, their value is probably still maybe $5,000-$10,000, where it could be 5 times that, I think, easily.
Yeah. Now, you know, I don't want you to give away your secrets, but what, you know, because this business is so competitive, as you know, when traveling to Japan, how are these cards and memorabilia items found or obtained? I mean, are there antique shops in Japan that you're able to pick up these issues?
There used to be. When I lived there, they had flea markets at shrines almost every Sunday. And what we would do is every Sunday morning, you know, the various Americans would go out to the different flea markets and look for Japanese baseball cards. And they were so hard to find that if you found something, you just bought it. Didn't matter if you had it or really what the price was. They weren't that expensive to begin with. You know, you could always trade it. There are Japanese baseball card shops, but they don't carry vintage cards. Which is bizarre. Sometimes I'll bring some over and show them to the card owners. They don't know what they're looking at. And I start explaining it's from the 1950s. And I go, oh, what? So you can still go over there. If you go into Tokyo, there are places where you might bump into them. But in the last, I'd say, 15 years or so, things have moved online. The antique dealers no longer bring the cards to the flea markets. They instead sell them to somebody online they know will deal in them. And most of the good stuff gets its way to the United States and gets put up for auction pretty quickly. There's Japanese who sell on eBay and then ship it right over from Japan. So right now, I would say the cost of beginning a Japanese baseball card collection today is much cheaper than it was 20 years ago because there's so much available on eBay directly from Japan. You can really pick up really some great bargains if you know what you're doing once you know the players.
Right. I mean, in the mid-1990s, Rob, I dabbled a little bit in Japanese baseball cards. They were very popular, like 1992, 1993, that
Right.
year. I dabbled a little bit in vintage Japanese baseball cards, very popular, along with the Cuban issues. But, I feel like in 2019, 2020, Japanese cards aren't as popular as they were, like you mentioned, 20 years ago. Why do you think that is?
I think because so few people knew about Japanese baseball cards before Nomo. And then Nomo comes over and people start collecting. Americans start collecting, I mean. And then Ichiro comes over and Matsui comes over, and you get another bump of people say, hey, let's get into these old cards. They're pretty undervalued. But because there hasn't been a lot written, there hasn't been a lot of excitement about the old Japanese players, the prices of those cards are still pretty much the same, if not even dropped, from the 1990s to the early 2000s. But what has gone up and what is a good investment are the star cards of players Americans know about. Sadahara O cards have gone way up over the last 20 years. Cards of Americans in Japan, like Yogi Berra, Joe DiMaggio, have gone up. And cards of real beauty, I mean, some of these Menko are striking. They've gone up in value because people look at it and say, hey, I really want that for my collection. But the common cards have been pretty flat.
So, in a nutshell, your thoughts on Sadahara O, still the most popular Japanese player to collect?
I think so. I mean, if you discount the new guys, I mean, there's a lot of people who collect the Ichiro and Otani, probably more people that collect them. But when it goes back to the vintage players, yeah, definitely. There's many collectors out there in the United States who kind of specialize in O cards. I did it for a little while. I have a friend who has the best O collection available. And every now and then I'll see somebody on the internet who says, I'm going to collect every possible Sadahara O card, which is quite a task. I mean, it's very challenging. He's got so many different issues. But it's fun. And one of the things about Japanese cards is there weren't standard sets until 1991. So where Topps and Bowman come out in the early 50s with cards of almost every single player in the major leagues, and they're numbered, that didn't happen in Japan until 1991. So what you're looking at prior to that for vintage cards pretty much are Menko and what we would call oddball issues, cards given away with gum and other food products, magazine inserts, regional sets. So you get this incredible variety, some incredible diversity of card design. And to me, that's one of the charms of Japanese baseball cards. So if you collect Sadahara O, you can get hundreds of different-looking cards.
Right, I was going to say, I mean, there's some issues of Sadahara O in which he's in the set in 3 or 4 different poses.
Right, exactly.
So let me ask you, Rob, your favorite Japanese baseball card issue is?
Well, it's not going to mean much to most people, but it's the 1948 Dreaming of Baseball Karuta set. And a Karuta is a game. It's a matching game where each card, for lack of a better word, has 2 cards. It has a picture card and an information card. And the idea of the game is you take the picture cards, you shuffle them, you put them face down on the floor, and then you deal out the information cards, and when the information card comes up with the clue, you then have to remember where the picture card is on the floor. And this is a traditional Japanese game, and especially played at New Year's. And it was very common for Karuta sets to be given as New Year's presents and then played that day. So as a result, the sets usually come in box sets. There are high-quality pictures. And in the case of the 48 set, high-quality drawings and colored drawings are beautiful. And that's why this is my favorite set. It shows so many of the stars of 1948, but its beauty, I think, is unsurpassed.
Wow. Now, for me, I consider the last of the vintage Japanese baseball cards issued to be the 79 TCMA Japan Pro baseball cards. Familiar with
Mhm.
those, Rob?
Yes, actually, I just spoke to the two designers of the set this last week and interviewed them. So yes, I am.
Any thoughts on that series? I know it's a 90 card set, very affordable today's market. You know, a lot of stars like Murakami, Nomuro, Harimoto. You think
Yeah.
that set is popular? I mean, it's still very affordable to invest in.
I think that's a great kind of entryway set to Japanese baseball because it is cheap. I mean, you can pick one up for $50 probably on eBay, maybe 75, maybe 35, depending on the day. It's got 90 cards in it. It has most of the Americans who played in '79 in the set. It has most of the stars. It was done by Ed Broder and Mike Ehrenstein of TCMA. And Ed had lived in Japan, was a baseball fanatic, and knew the players and knew who the stars were. So he handpicked who was going to be in that set. So it's packed full of Hall of Famers. So that's a great way for Americans to get started and kind of learn about who these guys are, look at the stats in the back. I disagree with you about the end of vintage collecting. I say the end of vintage collecting is 1990, and the reason for that is in 1991, BBM comes out with their first set that's numbered, has stats on the back, and has every player in the league. And before that, it's these oddball sets. So I think we have to find a different definition of vintage for Japanese versus American cards. But, hey, that's just my opinion.
All right, so then let's mention your website, current projects you're working on. Go right ahead.
Okay, well, my website is robfitz.com. It's very simple. It's basically dedicated to Japanese baseball history, my books. I write a blog that comes out about once a month. I do a Japanese history blog, sometimes on baseball cards, sometimes in kind of odd things on Japanese history that might interest Americans. My current projects, I just finished up this book, the Illustrated Introduction to Japanese Baseball Cards. Right now I'm taking a short break. I might do something on the Brooklyn Dodgers 1956 tour of Japan. I might do something on all the tours, kind of an encyclopedia of the tours of Japan that's never been written in English. I'm not quite sure right now. Kind of waiting to get out and finish up my book tour for the Issei Baseball, which is the book on early Japanese-American baseball. So I guess I'll figure out by August what the next project will be.
And you're happy to see baseball will be returning, 60-game season, huh?
I am very happy. Yeah, I'm not. It's funny because a lot of people assume that I'm a baseball fanatic, which I am. But because once you start doing baseball 9 to 5, I don't watch that many games at night. It's you read about baseball, you write about baseball, you sell baseball cards at night. A lot of times I was like, I just kind of want to read a mystery or do something a little different. So I probably only get to a couple games a year until the playoffs come around. Once the playoffs come around, I try to watch every inning.
No, I totally understand. So Amazon.com, we can search online Amazon and purchase some of your books that we talked about, right?
Absolutely. I would like, if listeners would like to help me out, purchase them off my website, robfitz.com, because then, you're buying straight from the author instead of going through a third party, and I will be happy to sign them for you.
Well, listen, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being on the program, okay?
Thanks for having me, Brian. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care of yourself, Rob.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That was Rob Fitz, award-winning author whose articles have appeared in numerous magazines and websites, including Nine, the Baseball Research Journal, the National Pastime, Sports Collectors Digest, MLB.com. and others. I mean, he is the author of 5 books, as we mentioned on the program, and his latest ebook for collectors listening to the program, an illustrated introduction to Japanese baseball cards. You can catch that online and on his website, robfitz.com. And I thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Until next week, happy collecting to all.